Hello and welcome to the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center's Teachers Workshop Series on Genocide. This is session 2 on the Cambodian Genocide. Back in session 1, we reviewed some terms: genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. All of those definitions located at the United Nations site that is addressed in session 1. We also referenced different systems of governance that are important for this study going forward. Those definitions are in session 1's folder as well, so you can retrieve them from there. In today's sessions, we're going to apply the terms genocide and the other 3 that we call mass human rights violations, the systems of governance, and Dr. Gregory Stanton's 10 Stages of Genocide, which is found at genocidewatch.com. We're going to apply those at different points to not just the genocide, but what led to, occurred during, and then followed slightly after what is called the Cambodian Genocide from 1975 to 1979. The information, the descriptions, and the photographs that we'll describe in this session are extremely graphic, as you would understand. So please preview any of the materials, including the activities that are presented at the end. Please preview them before using them with students. All right, to start, let's say that we did a man on the street interview. We went up to people, we asked, hey, can I have a second of your time? We asked them a question, what can you tell us about the Cambodian Genocide? Or maybe a better question, we'll just say, here's the topic, the Cambodian Genocide. Who comes to mind when we say the Cambodian Genocide? I believe a lot of times the most common answer that we'll get is, accurately, Pol Pot. A second answer that we could get, the less likely, would be the group, the Khmer Rouge. And if someone is very knowledgeable and or very savvy, they may say intellectuals, professionals, teachers, engineers, doctors, lawyers. They may even simplify it even easier, as did the Khmer Rouge, people who wore glasses. So there are some who's that we might get from different people on the street: Pol Pot, Khmer Rouge, people with glasses, professionals, intellectuals, that kind of thing. For the where, the obvious part that I think everyone would say is, well, it took place in Cambodia, which is correct. It's important, though, that we know that Cambodia was not in a vacuum. Cambodia was surrounded by countries that were involved in one way or another, Thailand and Laos, and by a country that was extremely involved, Vietnam. I think another where would be the killing fields, right? And not a specific geographic location, not one you could find on a typical political map, but a place name for the villages where millions of people were worked to death and or murdered. So another where would be the killing fields. And then the when. I think a lot of people would come up with the 1970s. They may just say the 70s. They may say early 70s, mid 70s, late 70s. And in a sense, well, first and foremost, we know that the genocide that we're studying is 1975 to 79. Those are the parameters. Those are the dates, the start and the end. But for our purposes, we're going to see that, of course, this genocide did not happen just in a vacuum, right? It didn't just pop up out of nowhere. There was a lead in, then the genocide, then there was a fall off from there, all of which included violence, unbelievable, sheer, brutal, horrific, horrifying violence. We will delve into the history part of this. We'll look at a high-level overview. Lastly, we need to quantify these events. This is not intended in any way to diminish each of the individuals who were involved, whether they survived or did not. In no way is it meant to diminish their humanity and to just put a number on them. We will keep cognizant that each of these numbers represents an individual human being. Speaking of numbers, there is no way to accurately account for the numbers. The ranges on different events and the totality are extremely broad, very broad. In that regard, I have endeavored to find something mid-range and then kind of err on the side of being conservative. So I'm trying to not blow this up into anything more than it needs to be. The numbers stand on their own. They're brutal. This is a horrific event, as we will see as we go into this. But just know that that gap is so broad that we won't walk away here having a specific number. For the Holocaust, we have 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis. We have 5 million others who got swept up in that as well. For the Cambodian genocide, due to record keeping, bombing, the razing of villages, the wanton intentional destruction of records by the Khmer Rouge, there is no way to really quantify this. So just know that when we give these numbers, they are extremely broad.
All right, so before we get into the material itself, I want to thank once again, as we did last session, session 1, I would like to thank the Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education. A huge support that they provide for institutions that provide teaching to teachers, so the teachers can then cascade that information onto their students. So big thanks to the Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education. Also, huge thanks to the Mural Color Educator Series. Same idea. These are 2 institutions, one statewide, Florida-wide, and the other located here at the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center, both centered on the idea of teaching teachers how to teach this information on Holocaust education and, parenthetically, the idea of genocide and genocide studies. So big thanks to both of those organizations for their support. And so when we talk about teachers, we're talking about public, private, homeschool, alternative education settings, religious settings as well, even really alternative settings such as a museum where there is teaching, but not in the traditional sense. So both of these organizations are really, really big help, and we really, truly appreciate their support. So first screen now of the material as we get into the Cambodian genocide. I think it's a stunning picture as the backdrop to this title page. Title page, the Cambodian genocide. The Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center is who's providing this training. This is Teachers Workshop Session 2. Session 1 was the introduction, where we went over all the definitions, of course, including genocide, and then the 3 mass human rights violations. I think this picture is stunning for the obvious reason. We have young boys, it could be anywhere between, say, 6 and 10, maybe a little younger, a little older, but let's just say 6 and 10. Guns that they're holding are probably almost as tall as them. So they look awkward the way they're holding those guns, and yet they don't look uncomfortable. So that tells me, for a couple different reasons, that this is not a question of conscription. Conscription, we saw, was an issue in the mass human rights violations, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and especially war crimes. Conscripting people, whether they agreed or didn't agree, conscripting young people under the age of 15 was a violation of war crimes. This does not look like a violation of war crimes. It looks like a violation of humanity, however. These young boys are very comfortable in their pose. In fact, the young man all the way to my left, possibly to your right as you're viewing this, even has a cute grin on his face. I mean, they're very comfortable in this setting. The 2 young boys holding the guns look very serious and as if they have no reckoning of a different world. And I think that's, unfortunately, that's what we see here. So stunning picture, and we'll see about photo activities towards the end of this talk. And this may be a photo that is, I think, incredible to use. And I think your students, if you're doing this with 4 students, I think they'd be stunned to see this photograph. We all know, of course, that historical events do not happen in a vacuum. So the Cambodian genocide didn't just emerge out of the ground one day and begin. there was quite a lead in. One of the groups that we will see that is pivotal during the Cambodian genocide is the Khmer Rouge, a name that we're familiar with, I think. The Khmer Rouge took that name almost to pay honor or homage to the Khmer Empire. Khmer Empire existed between the 10th and the 13th century. When we think of the Khmer Empire, we think of Angkor Wat or Vat. Pronunciation may be an issue, so if I make a mistake again, I apologize. But this is what we think of with the Khmer Empire between the 10th and 13th century. So the Khmer Rouge took their name from the Khmer Empire, and they brought that forward. And again, it was an honor to bring that name forward. It was to pay homage to those people, to the good old days, to the great days, to the pride and glory of the Khmer Empire. However, they also brought forward something that was endemic with the Khmer Empire, and that was a sense of racial superiority. Racial superiority based on skin color, and we will see how that plays out shortly in other ways. But the idea of racism is absolutely foundational for what leads into the Cambodian genocide. So again, reflective of their glory days and their sense of superiority, and that superiority based on skin color. So we're going to come forward considerably from the time period of the 10th to the 13th century. We're going to come forward to 1941. So that's where we'll start. Obviously, World War II is fresh, new, had just really begun in earnest in 1941. And that was at... And 1941 is when this young man that we see pictured here, Norodom Sihanouk. So again, if I mispronounce the name, I apologize. I will refer to him as Sihanouk going forward. We'll actually see, interestingly, if we look at a map of Cambodia, we see a town here that was renamed in the late 1950s, I think 1957. It was renamed Sihanoukville. So to pay honor and homage to Sihanouk, a man who was revered. So 1941. This is the map of Cambodia that we see obviously in the lighter color. And it is good to know the geography, the fact that Thailand lay to the north and northwest, that Laos lay to the mostly north, it looks like, and that Vietnam ran along its eastern and southern border. The famous Mekong River Delta that we will see plays a role in the Cambodian genocide, but certainly more so when we get into Vietnam. So this is the setting here. We'll come back to this map shortly. So 1941, among other things, World War II was in full swing, and this young man here, or this man here, Norodom Sihanouk, to be referred to as Sihanouk going forward, was about 18 years old, I believe, and he was crowned king. Now, 18 years old, didn't have maybe a great deal of, well, certainly didn't have a great deal of world experience. So he had to grow into his role, and he did. He grew in capacity. He grew in leadership as well, and confidence, so that by 1953, considerable number of years since he was crowned king, but by 1953, Cambodia was able to declare independence from the French, from France. Sihanouk ran the country as a quasi-authoritarian and a monarch. Well, he was a king, and he was fully in charge by the time he declared independence, and so it's not surprising that he ran this in an authoritarian or quasi-authoritarian way, and again, as a monarch. He certainly was that. Once again, Norodom Sihanouk stressed the same thing that the Khmer Rouge did, and that was Cambodian pride. That was always there, and that's something that would tend to make us feel that this is nationalism or patriotism. And it would be, except that Sihanouk's focus was on the majority people, that was the Khmer people, and that emphasis and support was based entirely on race. So by 1965, Sihanouk was either evolving politically or evolving philosophically, like people do, right? Since 1941, now we're up to 1965. That's a considerable time period during which a person might ebb and flow, learn and grow, change in philosophy, change in political philosophy as well. And it could be extreme, or it could have been a slow evolution. Nevertheless, by 1965, Sihanouk was definitely evolving, or he was looking at things in a more practical, pragmatic way, and that's a possibility as well. I don't know which it was, but either way, whether it was a natural evolution or it was more of a pragmatism issue, Sihanouk began to cut ties with the United States. At the same time as cutting ties with the United States, a foreign power, an imperial power, he was cozying up to, warming relations with the communist Chinese. Coincidentally, or perhaps they saw signs of this coming, by 1966, a year later, the Cambodian economy was under severe pressure and began to really, really decline. At the same time as it declined and as the economy declined, what came out was that the Sihanouk reign had a lot of internal corruption. The Sihanouk reign was corrupt internally. So that was what was revealed. I'll give you an example of his semi or authoritarian approach and also the corruption that existed. So Sihanouk wanted to build a sugar refinery. Grab the map. He wanted to build a sugar refinery here in Battambang province. That's the name of the province right here. There's Angkor Wat, by the way. And this is Battambang province, to the best of my ability. That's the pronunciation. So Battambang province. He wanted to build a sugar refinery there. So he expropriated the land from the villagers, the peasants who were living there. Simply took the land, and yes, they were compensated, but no, it was not a fair compensation whatsoever. So here we have the economy failing, beginning to fail. People, even peasants out in the provinces, even those peasants out in the provinces would have been feeling the economic pressure. Now they had land expropriated from them and without just compensation. So that created tension. So the tensions grew in this Battambang province to the point that by 1967, a year or so later, after the economy began to fail and the corruption was revealed, by 1967, troops were actually moved in to the Battambang province. The villagers, again, tensions rose. So villagers attacked some of the troops, not all of them, of course, but the villagers attacked some troops, and they ended up killing two of Sihanouk's troops, soldiers, individual soldiers. So that show of force actually kind of inspired other people from the province. And so this tension actually grew. And there was a kind of an idea of rising up against the government. And that's a big deal because the people revered Sihanouk. But this expropriation, this barely compensated expropriation of their land, started to drive them away from Sihanouk, at least the people in that Battambang province. All right, so the villagers in the area were rising up against the government. Maybe not necessarily Sihanouk personally, but the Sihanouk reign or Sihanouk government. Now, at the time, Sihanouk was actually out of the country. He was in France. And yet someone initiated sending paratroopers and soldiers into this province to deal with the villagers and the rising tensions. Now, the question is, was that Sihanouk who from France ordered the paratroopers and ordered the ground troops into and the national police into the province to deal with this? Or was he aware but not involved in the decision making? I don't know, and I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that. But he was in France when this took place. The soldiers were merciless. There were killings, there were bombings, there was even strafing from airplanes of villages. So the Cambodians were merciless, killing their own citizens, their own fellow countrymen. All right, so that escalation by the Sihanouk government, the Sihanouk reign of paratroopers and national police and troops on the ground, told Sihanouk that the issue had been resolved. So in his mind, it was over with. Now, the man on the ground was named General Lon Nol. Now, by on the ground, I do not mean he was in Battambang province. He was actually in the capital down here of Phnom Penh. Now, whether Nol, General Nol, requested, suggested, or ordered this or not, the troops in the province, Battambang province, began to send severed heads to General Lon Nol in Phnom Penh as proof of their following orders. So they were following General Lon Nol's orders. Were they following Sihanouk's? I don't know. So we don't know if Nol ordered this or not, but they were sending severed human heads to Phnom Penh. Allegedly, truckloads were sent with heads to Phnom Penh. These actions, I don't think surprisingly, inspired more people to revolt. So tensions continued to grow in the province and outside of the province as well. Villages were then burned. People were rounded up. Somewhere around 4,000 or so residents from Battambang province were driven out of the province. So they were driven into different provinces, into the jungles. They were driven out of that territory. So the uprisings spread in other provinces, villages were burned, and more heads were severed and sent as proof of following orders. Now, at the same time, General Lon Nol was embroiled in his own anti-communist crusade. So he said Sihanouk was starting to trend towards the communist Chinese, the Marxist Russians, and yet his general in charge, General Lon Nol, was trending towards anti-communism. So there was a conflict within there. So obviously, communists got caught up in these military actions. Guerrillas, Guerrillas, got caught up in this as well. But so did non-combatants, innocent citizens, civilians, residents of that and other provinces were also caught up in that, in the action. Ironically, Lon Nol, who was rabidly anti-communist, and these actions of Sihanouk to drive these people out of the province actually drove them physically out of the province, but philosophically towards the communists. So the communists actually garnered some more support from this because they were looking at kind of like stuck between a rock and a hard place, General Lon Nol or the communists. And so they started to kind of lean towards or trend towards the Communist Party. So the communists actually gained support, and General Lon Nol lost support. He ended up inadvertently driving people away from his political philosophy and drove them towards the communists. By 1968, now we're up to 1968. So by 1968, the Khmer Rouge were seeing a real growth in local groundswell of support from citizens and civilians. And these actions, these Battambang sugar refinery actions, and then the revolts and the tensions that grew and the fighting within led to the deaths approximately of 12,000 people. That's a real rough estimate. All right, so let's look at Norodom Sihanouk, his reign, and we will apply the definitions that we created of the different political philosophies. That's, once again, located on the website in Session 1's folder. And then we will also look at this and compare this section, this snippet, the Sihanouk's section, the Sihanouk reign and what resulted. We will look at this section and compare it with Dr. Gregory Stanton's 10 Stages of Genocide and see where things fit in. Again, this is not the Cambodian genocide. This is just what's leading into it. Sihanouk was a monarch who was quasi-authoritarian or authoritarian, hard to know, definitely heading towards socialism, and I think actually he was heading towards communism. Then the question at the end is, was his focus pride, Khmer pride as a Khmer, Khmer pride as a nation? No, it was a people, and it was a people based on color, so that was racism. So that was kind of the underpinnings of his political philosophy. The actions that took place under his reign, was it genocide? Clearly not. According to the definition, it was not genocide. This is a civil war. This is retribution. This is quite possibly crimes against humanity. They were targeting, Sihanouk and his military leadership were targeting civilians, non-combatants, fellow citizens, fellow countrymen. So quite possibly crimes against humanity. Were there war crimes committed? And I put maybe, because I don't have explicit information that says yes, but this was a civil war. I suspect some of those 12,000 deaths were war-related for non-combatants, therefore war crimes. And was it ethnic cleansing? Well, we talked about ethnic cleansing and how it's not really defined, how we have a feel for it. And if we just go with that feeling of what ethnic cleansing was, I think we would probably say maybe to no. So under Sihanouk, we have the tone being set for what was to follow, to what was to be the Cambodian genocide. But there's an interlude before we get to the Cambodian genocide. Okay, so now we mentioned General Lon Nol, and that is he. His reign after the coup was 1970 to 1975. So we are moving along date-wise. This is still not the Cambodian genocide. This is more that leads to this. General Lon Nol, ancient glory of racism, nationalism. So let's look into that a little bit. March of 1970, Lon Nol leads a coup. The coup deposed Sihanouk. Sihanouk at the time was, as we said, cozying up to the Communist Chinese and the Russians, the Marxist Russians, I suppose, the Marxist Soviets. He was actually in Russia at the time, Sihanouk was. Sihanouk being deposed, it obviously strengthened the relationship between, or among, I should say, the Communist Chinese, the Soviet Marxists, and Sihanouk. So that just built the relationship or strengthened their relationship. It also strengthened the relationship of Sihanouk with the Khmer Rouge. So that's important. If we look at the latter, if we look at Sihanouk and his followers and the Khmer Rouge together, they form what was called the National United Front. And it had a significant army. The army apparently, again, we said, was drawing in communist sympathizers. It absolutely was, to the point that this army, this unofficial army, the National United Front, was up to 125,000 troops. So significant number of troops. And in fact, those troops controlled about half of the country. So if you look at the map, half of that country, Lon Nol in Phnom Penh, this is the eastern side here where we'll see the blue and white scarf used to identify people. And then you have this area up in here. So 3 sections, 1, 2, and 3. And we have the National United Front, Sihanouk's followers, still loyal, and the Khmer Rouge, spoiling for a fight, controlling half of the country. So Nol's rationale or reasoning for the coup was a restoration of Cambodia's ancient glory. Well, that sounds exactly like what Sihanouk said, right? Sihanouk was about Cambodian pride, which we saw as skin color, superiority, race. Lon Nol wanted to revive this ancient glory, this Khmer Empire again. So there's that idea there. So they're not at loggerheads, they agree on that. But what they didn't agree on was how to go about doing it, obviously, since we have Nal and this coup. All right, so Nal actually continued Sihanouk's racist bent and this idea of superiority, and actually took this to the point where he, Lon Nol, wanted to prove the Khmer people, not the Khmer Rouge, but the Khmer people, their superiority was skin color based. Lon Nol and his followers, and many of the Khmer people, looked at the Chinese and the Vietnamese and their lighter skin tone and actually felt superiority in their darker complexion. So this is based entirely on skin color. General Lon Nol thinking that the Chinese and the Vietnamese were inferior because of their lighter skin coloring. Lon Nol's government, not unlike Sihanouk's, proved to be well, corrupt, we'll see, but proved to be inept. It was an administrative nightmare. I saw that somewhere, but definitely corrupt. And so that parallels Sihanouk's reign as well. Now, where he differed from Sihanouk, however, was in the relationship he had with the United States. Sihanouk broke off the relationship with the United States. General Lon Nol turned to the United States to kind of rekindle the relationship between Cambodia and the United States. I believe that was a marriage of convenience because both of these entities, General Lon Nol and his government and the United States, were absolutely anti-communist. This is the Vietnam War era. We'll see the Vietnam War as it flows in and out of Cambodia. The idea of the domino theory to stop the spread of communism. So Lon Nol turned to the United States to help to fight the communist presence that was in Cambodia, but also to drive the Vietnamese out of Cambodia back into Vietnam. We'll see the role of the United States shortly. Lon Nol actually targeted Vietnamese who were living in Cambodia. The ironic thing is that General Lon Nol saw foreigners, foreign powers, as suspect, something to not be to be trusted. We will see that this idea of foreign entities, foreign powers, all things foreign, we'll see how that rears its head. This is absolutely foreshadowing when we see the fall of Phnom Penh by the Khmer and the taking over of Phnom Penh and therefore the country by the Khmer Rouge. There were protests. So under General Lon Nol, there were protests. A lot of these were pro-Sihanouk, people still loyal to their king, Sihanouk. Oftentimes, the protests were peaceful. Oftentimes, the protesters were unarmed. However, oftentimes, many times, General Lon Nol's troops actually fired on these people, whether they were armed or unarmed. Another group targeted, besides civilians who were protesting, besides the Vietnamese who were living there, besides the communists living there, were Catholics. So we will see this anti-religion idea, though not necessarily strong under Lon Nol, we will see it absolutely powerfully strong under the Khmer Rouge. So Lon Nol targeted the Catholics. Here's an example of those actions. So somewhere between 500 and 800 or so Vietnamese Catholics were living in a Catholic settlement. They were rounded up. They had their hands tied, and then they were taken to the Mekong River. They were shot, and they were dumped into the river. At another site, a journalist went and visited the aftermath. This was a schoolyard, and what he saw, and here a direct quote, what he saw was, quote, like an abattoir with flies buzzing through the classroom and over the pools of coagulating blood, end quote. About a month or so after General Lon Nol's coup and deposing Sihanouk, United States and South Vietnamese troops began to enter Cambodia. They were trailing the North Vietnamese. They were actually looking to destroy North Vietnamese bases. The North Vietnamese at that time were in a very shaky alliance with the Khmer Rouge. Again, this idea of strange bedfellows. The North Vietnamese communists, the Khmer Rouge communists, they were linked obviously by their political philosophy, but the Khmer Rouge certainly looked at the North Vietnamese as inferior racially. By 1973, the Lan Nol government had really shown signs of weakening, so much that it was barely hanging on. It was barely able to resist the alliance of the Khmer Rouge and the North Vietnamese. So at this point, Lan Nol requested the United States really step up its bombing campaign. He wanted the United States to launch this massive, massive bombing campaign. Now we'll look at the U.S. Role, the bombings and so forth, as a separate entity. But under Nol's watch, fighting between North and South Vietnamese took place in Cambodia. So the Vietnam War spread into Cambodia and continued. One estimate is that, and again, what is the time frame of this? But one estimate is that nearly 500,000 people died as a result, soldiers, non-combatants alike. In April of 1975, after a long, brutal civil war, Phnom Penh fell. Lan Nol was there. Lan Nol fled as his reign came to an end, and he fled to the United States. He lived here in the United States. He died and is buried, I believe, in California. So Lan Nol's reign came to an end. He left from Phnom Penh. So we'll do the same thing we did with Sihanouk. We'll look at Lan Nol and see his political philosophy, where that fits in, and then we'll look at the actions that took place and compare them to Stanton's 10 Stages of Genocide. Again, the idea of trending this out so we can see if a political philosophy inevitably leads to genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and or ethnic cleansing. So Lan Nol. Lan Nol, as we said, was vehemently, rabidly anti-communist. He was a nationalist unless it was inconvenient. So he was a nationalist, absolutely, until he needed intervention by the United States military, at which point he became more a person of convenience than nationalism. He did govern by a council for a period, but then Lan Nol took over as an authoritarian. I wouldn't say a dictator, but as an authoritarian. And just like Sihanouk, was it pride in the ancient empire, or was it racism? Well, we've seen in both cases, racism wins out. So there's stark differences between Sihanouk and General Lan Nol, but there are also similarities as well. All right, so actions that took place under Lan Nol's reign. Was there genocide, just like Sihanouk? No. Were there crimes against humanity? Yes, just like Sihanouk, there were absolutely crimes against humanity. Were there war crimes? Again, this was a civil war. More than likely, just like Sihanouk, there were war crimes. And exactly like Sihanouk, was there ethnic cleansing? Once again, we don't have an actual definition of it. It's possible, but for sure, there were crimes against humanity. And yes, I would say most definitely there were war crimes. So what was the fallout from Lan Nol's reign? Was he kind of continued Sihanouk in a way, yet he involved the United States, which was already engaged in a war right next door in the Vietnam War. Okay, now, obviously the U.S., I'm going to talk about the U.S. military right here, their role. Obviously the U.S. wasn't running the country, but they play a significant role in different ways, as we'll see. And I want to be fair and kind of show the different groups that were involved, and that includes the United States military. So the U.S. Army and Air Force were involved almost from the start of Lan Nol's reign after his coup. Both of these institutions, U.S. Army and Air Force were engaged in campaigns, again, almost right from the start in 1970, all the way up to 1973 when it was called off. Really, if we look at it, the U.S. was involved from 1965 to 73, but again, in association with Lon Nol from 1970 to 1973. All right, we said that the Khmer Rouge was allied with the North Vietnamese. And so the United States Air Force began to target supply routes and bases that were hiding North Vietnamese, but also Khmer Rouge. The U.S. Air Force, engaged in and utilized a bombing tactic called carpet bombing, broad, wide, and indiscriminate bombing. Obviously, it could not discriminate between a North Vietnamese and a Cambodian non-combatant, a Khmer Rouge and a civilian. So the bombing campaign did not differentiate. It couldn't tell between a communist and a nationalist, a communist and a Lon Nol supporter. So many innocent non-combatants, as well as soldiers, North Vietnamese, Khmer Rouge, were killed from these bombings. Enemy villages may very well have held Khmer Rouge and or North Vietnamese. So they were struck. So to be fair, not all of the targeting was off, but by the end of this blitz, and we'll call it a blitz, by the end of this blitz in 1973, the U.S. Air Force had dropped something like 250 to 250,000 tons, not pounds, from B-52s. 250,000 tons of bombs. And if you look at this map, again, the pink showing bombing targets. And this is between 1965 and 73 for the map. But still, it gives you an idea of what was being bombed. All right, so some things, not in defense of, but just some things to point out regarding the U.S. bombing and its issues with the U.S. bombings were, one, that the maps that were used were often way outdated or just simply wrong. The U.S. Air Force was trying to target supply routes. Well, obviously a map wasn't regularly updated with supply routes. They were also trying to target enemy villages. But again, what if Khmer Rouge and or North Vietnamese were in a village for a period and then left? Now the village has returned to being a village of non-combatant peasant farmers. The village had returned to being one of peasant non-combatant farmers. And yet they were sometimes bombed. So maps had major issues. Military intelligence was also inadequate, whether it came from Cambodian or U.S. military. It was often inadequate. But there was negligence from the U.S. Air Force as well. There was absolutely negligence that led to the death of non-combatants in choice of targets and in the delivery. Whether it was relying on bad maps or bad intelligence, there was still an element of negligence that led to non-combatant deaths, which sounds like war crimes. At times, the bombing was reckless and wanton. And again, if you look at the map and you look at that pink, you can understand the idea of carpet bombing when that whole section right there is loaded, is covered in pink. And so there has to be some sense of wanton recklessness in there and negligence by the U.S. Air Force. Now, this was war. This was a time of war, civil war. The U.S. involved in the Vietnam War. So does this become war crimes? Intent, we saw in session 1, intent is the key. Was this done with foreknowledge, and was it physically done? So the mental intent aspect of war crimes, was this done intentionally to kill? And on one hand, I want to say no, but on the other, if there was wanton, reckless negligence, I would say yes. I would say that qualifies as war crimes. That's my thinking, that it did qualify as war crimes. So intent is the key. It's impossible in a way to determine, but again, with the idea of being recklessly wanton and negligent, it certainly is close, if not war crimes, it's certainly close. There were innocent deaths. And that was whether military insufficiencies, lack of information, or lack of care. Raining down from the sky, many people were killed unnecessarily by U.S. bombs. We'll see the numbers shortly. And not dissimilar to General Nal's attack on the villages, driving people to the communists, these bombings by the U.S. Air Force drove people away from the United States, support of the United States, and drove them towards the Khmer Rouge and the communists as well. The option, again, between a rock and a hard place. Do you support General Lon Nol, who's got the U.S. Air Force dropping bombs on innocent people? Or do you go to the Khmer Rouge and the North Vietnamese and the communists? All right, so the number of military and non-military deaths are virtually impossible to determine. Estimates are broad, so this will give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Estimates range from a low of 3,000 non-combatants to a high of 200,000 non-combatants. And if you think about it, I wonder who would have said it was 3,000. The U.S. Air Force, the U.S. military, and General Lon Nol would have downplayed it, in other words. I wonder who said it was 200,000 non-combatants. My guess would be it was the Khmer Rouge, the North Vietnamese, the communists. So what is a fair number? What's a reasonable estimate to come up with? One source I saw estimated approximately 60,000 non-combatants killed due to U.S. bombing. That's an astounding number of innocent, unnecessary deaths. So whether it's 3,000 or 200,000, staggering numbers. 60,000 is huge. Well, what if it's half that, 30,000? That's still innocent people, non-combatant villagers who were killed, again, due to military insufficiencies, but also to negligence by the United States Air Force. So you can understand the growing anti-American sentiment, right? I mean, it kind of makes sense. So as an example, one peasant from a village that was erroneously or unconcernedly bombed. I don't know which. Was it bombed due to military insufficiency, or was it bombed due to negligence? I don't know. So one peasant from a village, his village was bombed, stated, quote, "The Vietnamese stopped coming to the village. In the same year, the village had to endure 3 months of intense bombardment by American B-52 planes. Bombs fell on Ban Tay Tre 3 to 6 times per day, killing over 1,000 people, or nearly 1/3 of the village population in the 3 months," end quote. So now we've got our third group. We've got Sihanouk, we've got General Lon Nol, now we've got the U.S. military's involvement. We're up to about 1975. Life for innocent non-combatants living in Cambodia, never knowing from which direction, from which group death could come. It must have been a perilously terrifying way to live. Around them in the jungles, above them in airplanes. There could be troops, the Cambodian troops under General Lon Nol. There could be the Khmer Rouge, their guerrillas. The North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese were even fighting within the confines of Cambodia, as we see. So, and of course, then the United States Air Force. So what a way to live as a non-combatant in Cambodia, surrounded on the ground and from above, not knowing where death could possibly come. So perilous, terrifying way to live for them. So let's look at the United States military in the same way we've looked at Sihanouk and General Lon Nol. I think it's fair to do. Again, the United States was not in charge, but to keep this trend going, since we're now at the precipice of on our timeline, the precipice of the Cambodian genocide itself. So let's look at the U.S. involvement. The U.S. was obviously anti-communist. Again, this was the anti-communist domino theory the United States was employing at the time. The U.S. was democratic with a small d, a representative republic. Governmental philosophy of the U.S. I don't think played a role as much. The fact that it was anti-communist, and we could say imperialism. We could say imperialist. So to really cover this broadly, it was a democratic representative republic with with an imperialistic outlook. All right, so actions, again, by the United States, specifically the United States Air Force, courtesy of its government. Was there genocide? Absolutely not. It was just like Sihanouk and Lan Nao, there was not genocide. Were there crimes against humanity? And that's a question. Again, it depends on the intent, the mental part of this, not the physical. The physical we've seen, there was death caused by American soldiers, but especially the U.S. Air Force. There were deaths caused of non-combatant innocents. So the intent is the question, and of course, how does one determine the intent now going retroactively? But were there war crimes? And yes, in my estimation, there were war crimes. Again, the negligence part of it, which in a way kind of talks to the mental intent, doesn't it? So yes, I would say war crimes were evident. Was there ethnic cleansing? Again, once again, we don't have a definition for it. I don't believe so. I think the U.S. military was killing communists, and if other people got in the way, they didn't seem to. Communists and North Vietnamese, and if others got caught up in it, that was a casualty, literally a casualty of war. So the U.S. military certainly continued the violence that was taking place in Cambodia. There was indiscriminate death and negligence. That is leading us up to the doorstep now of the Cambodian genocide.
All right, so now we're going to get into the genocide itself, the Cambodian genocide. See the years there, 1975 to 1979, that is the genocide. The period of rule, however, for this particular group, which includes Pol Pot, but the Khmer Rouge rule extended beyond Pol Pot's reign. So the Khmer Rouge rule extended beyond Pol Pot's reign, which was 75 to 79. And so we're going to dig into that, back to Lan Nao, General Lan Nao. So the civil war that really raged on since the Lan Nao coup came to a conclusion in 1975. And that kind of ushered in the Khmer Rouge into power. Finally, what they had been yearning for so long. Now, just because they had yearned for it didn't mean that everyone did. And so note that there were coups and rebellions, open rebellions along the way during the Khmer Rouge rule. And even to Pol Pot specifically, to his leadership. So almost immediately, the Khmer Rouge attacked the Vietnamese. This is the group that they had previously, just recently, been allied with. So now that the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot had power of control of Cambodia, now they decided to sever ties with people who they also considered inferior racially, not politically, racially. There were skirmishes that took place with the Vietnamese, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 were killed just in that alone. That number, while significant for each of those individuals, pales to what we're about to encounter, however. All right, so the Khmer Rouge. Khmer Rouge formed as a political entity or a political party back in the early 1950s. In 1970, while General Lan Nao was overthrowing Sihanouk and forming his government, there was an internal purging of Khmer Rouge leadership. Kind of interesting. It parallels the again from the Holocaust. The purge of the SA, the Sturm Abteilung, the brown shirts. it parallels that with the purge. So the SA was out, the SS was in. In this case here, there was an internal purge. And this is also foreshadowing of a lot more internal purges, suspicions among the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot. So nearly half of the leadership was removed. By 1971, despite that, they had accumulated a significant sizable army and tested out and began to actually test out their idea of collectivization. So this is where they really started to implement, still under General Lon Nol, but they started to implement this idea of collectivization. We'll see how that goes initially. That was the same year, 1973, which coincides with the end of the US bombing campaign in Cambodia. 1973 also is the year that the United States and the Vietnamese signed the Paris Peace Agreement, which ended America's involvement in the Vietnam War. When the Khmer Rouge assumed actual control of the government, or governance of Cambodia, in 1976, they formally created a vision for the country, quote, a wealthy, modern country by 1990, end quote. The way they were going to realize that long-term goal was through an extreme Marxist, Maoist brand of communism. So elements of Marx in the Soviet Union and Mao in China, with whom Sihanouk had created relations so many years earlier now. So they were going to create this idyllic country, collectivized country, under utilizing those two forms of governance: Marxism, Marxist communism, Maoist communism. They were going to, quote, they wanted to establish the most advanced and purest form of communism in the world, end quote. So that's what they were after, was a pure version of communism. Now, once installed, the Khmer Rouge began that internal purge, which was reminiscent of the early Nazi Party, and the Night of the Long Knives purge, which took out once extremely pivotal, important members of that, the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts. It actually purged out critical people who had been elemental in Hitler's rise and acquisition of power, but then an internal purge. So, Night of the Long Knives. Same idea here within the Khmer Rouge. Those within the Khmer Rouge who were deemed not dedicated enough to the cause of this pure form of communism, who also had been a city dweller, or who had been trained by Khmer Rouge communists in the city, were still looked at as suspect. So those groups were then purged, and now the Khmer Rouge were able to, or decided to, turn their focus even on the peasants of the areas. In 1974, in a village called Odong, O-U-D-O-N-G, Odong, the Khmer Rouge forced the whole population into the jungle. Then what they did was they separated out teachers and government officials and proceeded to kill the teachers and government officials. So for that brutality, they actually saw similar to what General Lon Nol saw by attacking the communists and driving people towards communists. The United States Air Force saw by bombing inadvertently or intentionally citizens and driving citizens towards the Khmer Rouge and the communists. Same thing happened here, where the Khmer Rouge, their brutality was so quick and pervasive and insistent and brutal that they actually started to drive people south, down towards Phnom Penh, where Nol had been, General Lon Nol had been. The Khmer Rouge noticed that, and they determined that they needed to lessen their stranglehold and their verve, I guess, to create this pure form of communism. They decided to step back. We'll take this a little bit slower. In pursuit of this purest form of communism, the Khmer Rouge took a common but significant step, and I mentioned this earlier. This was the outlaw of religion, the outlawing of religion, specifically Buddhism. They outlawed Buddhism in Cambodia, which was a major, significant majority religion for sure. So, an example. There was an estimate that showed between 40 and 60,000 Buddhist monks. Approximately 1,000 remained at the end of Pol Pot's reign in 1979. Between 40 and 60,000 down to 1,000 Buddhist monks targeted for their religion. Monks who lived during that time were forbidden to pray. Another unfortunate tactic of the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot was the destruction of cultural, historical monuments and statues. What they were doing, again, was the Khmer Rouge were now erasing the contemporary to replace it with the glory days from the Khmer Empire from way back in the 10th to 13th centuries. In order to do that, they needed to expunge what was more recent, and that included monuments and statues and cultural markers as well. One estimate suggests that as much as, in terms of percentage, as much as 95% of Cambodia's temples were destroyed or converted into buildings whose function was meant to demean the temple. In other words, a warehouse. What had once been a temple now is reduced to warehousing products, and that was done as a kind of a sadistic insult in a way. Other extreme steps included the elimination of money, currency, probably more accurately, currency, the elimination of free speech, the elimination of the freedom of movement, freedom of association, and more, rights that we take for granted in America, and we will address that with an activity that I think would be important and helpful for students. Old traditional songs were forbidden. Again, that cleaning out the old, expunging the old unless it went back to the Khmer Empire. So expunging more recent history. Farming was collectivized. Village residents were forced to work schedules that were chosen by the cadre, which sets up kind of an interesting semi-autonomous governance of cadres in villages. The farming schedules were made by the cadre, and they made for extremely long days, waking up in the dark, going home and going to sleep in the dark. Young village peasants were expected to work, more accurately, to perform slave labor, 6 years old and higher. It's interesting that the age 6 comes up because, like the Holocaust, age 6 was the age where Jewish children were deemed that they had to wear the yellow Star of David. Here we have 6-year-old peasants deemed to be capable of extreme hard labor. These days were long. People who were 6 years old or over, and who for some reason were could not work efficiently enough, were considered useless mouths. That should bring something from the Holocaust to us as well. Useless mouths was not dissimilar to the Nazis' concept of life not worthy of life. And in fact, we'll see that in an example of what happens in Phnom Penh. Strikingly similar idea. A life not worthy of life. A death sentence awaited those who were lazy, or who did unsatisfactory work, or who even complained about the work that was required, the hours that were required, the food that was allotted to them. So people who complained could very easily face a death sentence. Between 800 and 1,200 calories were allotted for their efforts. Again, a connection with the Holocaust, considerably more calories than people would have received in, for example, the Warsaw Ghetto or the Lodz Ghetto. But that's what was allotted to the peasants. And again, they're working, 8, 10, 12, 14-hour days of hard physical labor in a field, farming. And that was what they were allotted to for sustenance. These areas, these fields where these people worked, these peasants worked, became known as the killing fields. You see a couple more stark photographs of a child at an execution and of the results of the killing fields. Mountains of skulls and bones from people who starved or were outright murdered for lack of work performance. There was essentially no legal system. The cadre who managed or ran each of these individual villages, the cadre became the law. They became the justice system. Schools and books were outlawed. In fact, anyone who was discovered with a book was considered holding a Western type of possession and therefore could have been executed for that. So here's where we start to see this idea of those who were intellectually curious, the teachers, government officials, people who possessed books were to be expunged, not unlike the statues and cultural monuments that they had expunged, and Buddhist monks who they expunged. They were cleaning out their society to make a perfect racial society, but at what cost? Well, we'll see, it's a tremendous cost. Even eating was managed by the cadre. It was done communally. Preparation and eating was actually done communally. Meals generally consisted of rice, as we would expect, and sometimes, on rare occasions, included some meat protein source. Due to the mismanagement of the agricultural system as they began to and then got into collectivization, due to the inefficiencies of that system, people began to starve. They began to experience hunger and then starvation, which is a foreshadowing of what we'll see actually post Pol Pot. So theft of food occurred. The penalty for which, if one was caught, was, of course, death. So we see that life, this is also like the Holocaust and the Nazis, life was absolutely valueless. And we'll see a quote that captures that, a quote by Pol Pot, a slogan of the Khmer Rouge. And we'll see a quote that absolutely encapsulates that. Life was worthless. It was so expendable. It was easily replaced in pursuit of, in this case, in pursuit of pure communism. There was a Khmer Rouge soldier who much later on recalled, quote, "People were eating banana leaves, sugar palm roots, coconuts, and finally weeds," end quote. This is reminiscent of prisoners at Auschwitz and those on death marches, including a man named Abe Price, with whom I worked, a survivor who passed a few years ago now, who talked about seeing that at Auschwitz, people eating grass, pulling grass out of the ground to eat, to survive. Things got worse. Families were not allowed to remain intact. Camps were set up with barracks for children, for young men, for young women, and for spouses, but the spouses were separated into the males and the females. So they were actually split up. So families were nuclear families were dispersed. This is also like the Holocaust in that the idea of the ultimate Nazi state was one without religion, was one that was racially pure, and one that there wasn't a family. The family became the nation, and the god became Adolf Hitler. In some villages, and again, this is why I mean that the cadres managed different villages as semi-autonomous governments. And so they had different rules. This was not a dictate from Pol Pot that each village was managed the same way. So it varied from place to place. So for example, in some villages, young people couldn't even hold hands. So a young man and a young lady could not hold hands. In fact, had they been caught holding hands, that was also a crime or an act that could have been met with a death sentence. To take this a step further to the seemingly absurd, idle talk was outlawed, was forbidden. Even laughter was banned, along with music. So you've taken away talk, laughter, and music. Those over 16 were forced into military service. These young boys were definitely not 16, and based on their pose and their poise at what they're about to do, I would say that they had been reared in this Khmer Rouge communist mindset and didn't need to be conscripted. However, those over 16 in outlying villages, as the villages were absorbed by the Khmer Rouge, were conscripted. Those who refused or attempted to get away were, not surprisingly, killed as well. This is an absolute violation of what we know as war crimes, conscription. I mentioned husbands and wives, spouses being separated into a male barracks and a female barracks. Their sexual life was even restricted and managed by the cadre. Calling a spouse a term of endearment was forbidden. So an example, there was a man named Ngor, N-G-O-R, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but N-G-O-R, Ngor. And he was informed on for allegedly having called his wife, quote, sweet, end quote. A simple term of endearment, forbidden because of that emotion, the emotion that was in it. Sweethearts were forbidden. So he was taken to prison. He was tortured. He had a finger cut off. He had an ankle sliced, from which he barely survived. He did survive, but barely. Now, later on, Ngor's wife was expecting and ready to deliver a child, but she was experiencing complications. Ngor was a doctor, but he faced a conundrum. Demonstrate his book learning, his intellectual IQ, his skills, his Western orientation. Demonstrate that by utilizing his medical skills to attempt to save his child and wife, for which he would have been killed, or remain silent and not let on that he was a doctor and hope that the other women were able to help successfully deliver the child, successfully and safely deliver the child. That did not happen. Both died. The baby and Ngor's wife died during the childbirth. Speaking of doctors, of approximately 450 doctors who were alive in 1975, this is when Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge assumed absolute control. So of the 450 doctors alive at that point, only 50 were alive at the end of Pol Pot's reign in 1979, from 450 to 50. So more on that idea of emotion now. So when parents were told that their child had died from a mandatory labor, as part of a mandatory labor brigade, they were not allowed to express emotions. They were told your child died, and they were to remain straight-faced, not cry, not gasp, not crumple, but remain emotional, at least expressing no emotion. And children were trained to not respect their parents. More parallels to the Nazi, what the Nazis ideally wanted. And so the Hitler Youth, the boys and the girls version, were designed to actually participate in separating the family as well. The idea was to get the mom going to her group, the man going to his group, the daughter going to hers, and the son to his, absolutely separated. Again, the state becoming the center, not the family. Similar idea here, with children being trained to not respect their parents. So we've talked about the idea of racism with Sihanouk, with General Lon Nol, and it's certainly the case here with Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. Demonstrating that were killings of Chinese, Vietnamese, Thais, and Laotians. So if you recall, we saw the map. So Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge determined that killing their own people, nationally or racially, they were superior to Thais, people from Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and then China, which we don't see here. So there was that idea of, again, of superiority. And that was based on what were considered inferior ethnicities to the Khmer people. There was even a Muslim minority at the time, and it was spelled C-H-A-M, Kham or Cham. Significant minority of Muslims, the Kham or Cham, were targeted by Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. They were religious, and therefore, as the Catholics and the Buddhists had been attacked and targeted and forbidden, now the Muslims as well. Kham or Cham villages were destroyed in a province, resulting in the murder of the 20,000 people population of the area. The Cham or Kham's Grand Mufti, and this is graphic warning, horrible stuff. The Cham's Grand Mufti was captured and was thrown into boiling water and then dispatched with a blow of a metal pipe to the head. The first Mufti was beaten to death, and the second was disemboweled. In the end, approximately 125,000 Cham or Kham were murdered based entirely on their religious cultural choice. The fall of Phnom Penh in 1975. Phnom Penh fell. This is as General Lon Nol was boarding a helicopter and departing from the capital to save his life. The city rejoiced. A very short-lived celebration. And this was done not necessarily because the people in the city were oriented the same way as the Khmer Rouge, but they thought, all right, maybe things are now done. Maybe things can return to some sense of normalcy, stability. Maybe the Khmer Rouge won't be so bad. There was a short-lived celebration. Now the soldiers, we've seen several pictures of soldiers of this age, of this 8 to 10 to 12 to 14 to 15, something like that. They were mostly teenagers. They were there in mass numbers, these teenage soldiers. And they initiated an almost immediate evacuation of the capital city of Phnom Penh, where the inhabitants of the city were dispersed in different directions to different villages randomly, indiscriminately. It wasn't designed ahead of time. Lists weren't made. People were dispersed at the end of a gun barrel into the jungle and into villages. The soldiers we just mentioned were teenagers. Most of them we might consider children. They had been trained, as I was saying, you can see the hardness in this young boy's face. They had been trained not unlike the Waffen SS from the Holocaust, the Waffen SS, to kill without emotion. And so the Khmer Rouge had these young children practice on dogs, cats, monkeys, and other animals. Okay, so Phnom Penh, the capital city. Cities, as we kind of either said or alluded to, were considered capitalist in nature. They were Western oriented. So every one of the approximately 2 to 3 million inhabitants of Phnom Penh were dispersed into the jungle to various villages. And in a sense, it became something of a death march. Again, a Holocaust-related or Holocaust parallel, a death march. And it didn't matter if a person was ill or incapacitated in any way. They were required to evacuate Phnom Penh. If they couldn't leave, they were killed. An eyewitness later stated that he saw a dead child every 600 feet. And it is estimated that somewhere between a low of 40,000 and an incredible, staggering 400,000 died during the evacuation of Phnom Penh. Quote, a few days after the fall of Phnom Penh, a communist soldier strode up to a blind beggar sleeping on the ground by a temple. Without any warning at all, he thrust his bayonet into the beggar's stomach, killing him. When an onlooker bravely asked the soldier why he did that, the soldier answered, he could never work in the fields. He was useless to society. It is better for him to die. Professionals and businessmen, government officials and teachers, doctors and lawyers, engineers and scientists now became the enemy. Their options were re-education or death. The idea was actually to take them down a peg, to make them peasants, to live on collectives, and that the skills of the professional were something a peasant would acquire naturally. So of approximately 20,000 teachers alive before Khmer Rouge control, only 1/4 were alive post Pol Pot. Teachers were targeted. Those who spoke French, having been a French colony for a long time, those who spoke French or English, of course, were considered Western, could be executed. This went so far as people with a secondary education above what we would equate to 7th grade were considered intellectuals and therefore were worthy of, in the Khmer Rouge's eyes, were okay to be executed. And of course, the well-known case of, not totally pervasive, but the well-known case of people who wore glasses, because it demonstrated in the Khmer Rouge's collective mind, it demonstrated that these people read a lot and therefore they needed glasses, and therefore the reading was Western oriented and was frowned upon, to say the least. A horrifying example of the collective mindset of young soldiers who had been brainwashed in a sense, and the targeting of teachers. One teacher was deemed unfit for his inability to instruct about anything more than soil cultivation. The group of school children gathered him up, put a noose around his neck, threw the other end of the rope over a branch of a tree, and with a bit of torture of pulling him up and letting him down and pulling him up and letting him down, they chanted, unfit teacher, and killed him. A Cambodian man named Heng Chan, or Heng Chan, was married to a woman who was of Vietnamese descent. The Khmer Rouge killed her, their 5 sons, their 3 daughters and 3 grandchildren, and an additional 16 relatives of aunts and uncles and cousins and so forth of the wife. The numbers by the end of Pol Pot's reign, and I think at this point we call it a reign of terror, the numbers are staggering. It's possible that 200,000 ethnic Chinese, 150,000 Vietnamese, 12,000 Thais, 5,000 Catholics, 3,000 Protestants, plus the Cham or Kham Muslims that we talked about just recently, were killed. Those numbers are staggering, and they reveal the racist, bigoted, anti-religious foundation of the Khmer Rouge. The infamous prison, Tuol Sleng, or S21, accounted for more tragic examples of torture and murder. Many of the inmates of S21 were actually former Khmer Rouge, so this idea of an internal purge continued. It wasn't just that one time. It was a continuing situation with people reporting one another. Often prisoners were suspected of being a spy. For who? For the CIA or the KGB or even the Vietnamese. So that was an easy accusation to hurl at someone. So-and-so's a spy with the CIA, the KGB, the Vietnamese. That suspicion was pretty much all that was needed, because a confession was going to come. Whether the person was a spy or not, a confession would come. In 1976, approximately 2,250 prisoners were killed at S21 alone, just one example of their prison system. The next year, 3 times as many were killed. By 1978, they were on their way to a 5-fold increase of those murdered from 2 years earlier. S21 may have seen 20,000 executions. A pitiful 14 individuals are alleged to have survived S21. You see here the rules translated by a Cambodian first speaking person, so that the English is not 100%, but you get the idea. This is the security. This is how a person had to act at S21. And this is just one block of S21 prisoners. By the end of Pol Pot's reign, again 1979, children between the age of 6 and 14 lacked basic educational skills. The country experienced a 40% illiteracy rate. The Khmer Rouge fled power as Vietnam successfully invaded Cambodia and set up a socialist government under the Vietnamese. We determined clearly that Pol Pot, his governance and philosophy was communist. In a strange way, it was semi-autonomous. There were these fiefdoms. The cadres managed villages. So it was semi-autonomous. Under his reign was there genocide? Clearly and absolutely, and the numbers we'll get to are enormous. Were there crimes against humanity? Absolutely. Were there war crimes? This is a probable. Was there ethnic cleansing? Probably, once again, depending on what the definition of ethnic cleansing was. We saw the numbers of Chinese, of Vietnamese, based on ethnicity. So that would qualify. If we had an actual legal definition from the United Nations, that I think would qualify Pol Pot and his reign as one that perpetrated all 4 of these crimes: genocide and the 3 mass human rights violations. But this doesn't end. This ends the genocide, Cambodian genocide. But just like it didn't spring up out of the blue in a vacuum, it didn't just come to a complete conclusion and everything returned to normal. So this didn't end just like the Holocaust. It didn't just end in 1945 and people went home to live happily ever after. Europe was destroyed. There were millions, 8 or 9 million displaced persons with nowhere to go. So just like that, the genocide didn't just end and everything returned to normal. So we'll look at one more person. So there's another man we're going to talk about, and his name is Heng Samrin, Heng Samrin, as you can see right there, Samrin. And you can see his reign, 1979 to 1992. Heng Samrin was a high-ranking member of the Khmer Rouge. He actually had to escape during a purge that took place in 1978. He fled to Vietnam. When he ended up coming back and taking over for Pol Pot, he found Cambodia in horrendous, horrible shape. People were starving due to the inept running of the agricultural system. Basics like rice and corn were difficult to produce. Farm implements, animals to pull carts, and the loss of farm workers who knew from experience or training were unavailable as well. So there was a loss of farm workers. The famine obviously became well known, as seen here with a Time magazine cover. A horrible, horrible picture of starvation in Cambodia. And this is dated September of 1979. So this is what Heng Samrin found were horrific conditions. So the United States and the United Nations stepped in with massive amounts of an injection of money, but an injection of food and other aid, physical aid that could have gone to the people. This was to fight the starvation, so direct aid to fight starvation. Regime change, however, was not on the docket for either the United States or the United Nations. So Heng Samrin, a Khmer Rouge member, remained in power. And as we see, from 1979 to 1992, he was there. In reality, Samrin continued much of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge's ideology and their actions, what they actually did on the ground. So, for example, farming remained collectivized. Hard to believe with the results, but farming remained collectivized, and despite that famine, there was even forced labor still, and I saw something that there was also a continued kind of political murder. The economy was managed from a central setting. Free thought and expression were still controlled, not forbidden, but controlled. And purges, arrests, torture, executions continued as if Pol Pot never left. That's what I mean. I mean, this did not start from a vacuum and did not end immediately after Pol Pot. So it's a continuum of violence. That's why I want to look at the different forms of governance and the philosophies that went into that. So the Khmer Rouge system just basically continued. There were even forced evacuations of other towns. So an example, in 1979, this is post-Pol Pot. The Khmer Rouge resumed guerrilla actions, claiming territory on the border with Thailand. So we saw the map. So the Khmer Rouge claimed territory to the north on the border with Thailand. According to refugees who escaped, not the camp setting, but the Khmer Rouge, murder continued as well. Youngsters, young people, boys and girls, pregnant women, and others were forced to carry supplies for the Khmer Rouge. They were forced to carry supplies into the war zone for the Khmer Rouge, risking being killed by bullet or a mine. And shockingly, with all this going on, there was a guerrilla force still loyal to Sihanouk, who was active and engaged in various military operations that included murder and torture. The death toll under Samrin is like the others. It's just very difficult to estimate. According to the CIA, the death toll for one period between July and December of 1979 alone equated to 10 people dying for every one born. So that gives us an idea. It doesn't give us a number, but it gives us an idea. 10 die, 1 born under Samrin for that time period. Causes of death were, of course, absolutely this horrific famine, but also rampant disease which came with this, and ongoing military actions throughout the country of Cambodia. So we will do as we've done for the others, for Sihanouk, General Lon Nol, the U.S. Army, Pol Pot, and the Khmer Rouge. Now we're going to look at Heng Samrin and the Khmer Rouge and the system of governance, the philosophy that he utilized. Samrin was a socialist, was an authoritarian, militant and totalitarian. Actions, again, we're looking at the comparing to the United Nations definitions. Was there genocide under his reign? No. Were there crimes against humanity? Absolutely. So we've seen that across the board, crimes against humanity. Were there war crimes? Most assuredly, most probably, yes. And was there ethnic cleansing? No, but there was still mass murder. All right, so how do we take this, excuse me, so how do we take this broad high-level overview from 1941 all the way up to 1979, and then hone in on, in particular, hone in on the Cambodian genocide? How do we translate this? How do we make this applicable for students if you're working with students? There's a simple activity I think that can be done. It's located in Session 2's folder on our website. And it's based on Dr. Gregory Stanton's 10 Stages of Genocide. So the idea is for students to define, to the best of their abilities, to not take the massive definitions of each of those stages, to kind of come up with it in their own terms, and then to give one example from the Cambodian genocide. The information on Gregory Stanton can be found at genocidewatch.com. That's where the 10 stages are posted. The answer sheet and the worksheet are located in Session 2. So I've got an image of what it might look like. So the worksheet would be some setup like this. We would have stage 1. Stage 1 we've seen is classification. So I put it in my terms as to create an us versus them dynamic. What examples do we have from the Cambodian genocide? Well, us, the Khmer Rouge, versus the educated, versus those wearing glasses, versus those who were religious. Again, Buddhist, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, didn't matter. For those who were Western oriented, for those who were professionals, for those who were city oriented, us versus them. Civilization was equating the enemy with some form of object. So I think, for example, the example might be glasses. Again, people who wore glasses, that object might denote, might become symbolic of the people to be killed, along with the blue scarf that was required. If you've seen the images of the blue scarf, I've got an image which will be coming up, required to be worn by the educated or the intelligent, and these were mostly from the eastern part of Cambodia along the border with Vietnam. Stage 3, define discrimination. Well, this is when the group in power denies rights to the others. And I think an example would be where the cadre becomes the law in a particular village, and therefore does not extend national rights, but whatever rights they decide. Dehumanization, kind of obvious, denying a group's humanity. So an easy example is in the Holocaust, where Jews were equated with vermin, with disease, with bugs. We see that with in Rwanda with the Hutu and the Tutsis. Same idea of this idea of equating a person, removing their humanity, and now projecting onto them that they're cockroaches and bugs. There wasn't a similar example with the Cambodian genocide, but there was this removal of expression. Remember, no idle chit chat, no laughter, no holding hands, no saying sweetheart. Removing that humanity. When you were told your child was dead, no expression of emotion. So I think that kind of gives us an idea of dehumanization, even to the point of removal of names. So Pol Pot, when talking with his second in command, they would converse Pol Pot would say to brother number two, and brother number two would say yes, but not yes Pol Pot, but yes brother number one. So they referred to themselves and actually removed that name that gives people their humanity. One of the things that gives people their humanity. Organization, this is where the state organizes people into groups. And the example I came up with was the barracks. Young children, young men and women, husbands and wives separated, so kind of organizing people within villages, and then internally within the villages, organizing them into barracks, work details, and so forth. Polarization is where even segregated groups were divided further. So we saw, interestingly, we saw the idea of internally the Khmer Rouge seeing spies everywhere. I think he's a spy for the KGB. That person's a spy for the CIA. That person's a spy for the Vietnamese. And so now, even within the group in power, they are polarizing themselves. They're polarizing from within. Preparation, this is where victims are typically put on lists. I mentioned that before, that there were not lists that I know of during the Cambodian Genocide, but there were groups of people who were forced into villages managed by cadres. So there was that preparation and ease of control of the people because they were under the cadre's thumb. Persecution is utilizing a group's identity against people. So the Cham or Kham, the Catholics, the Protestant killings, for instance. Extermination, where the killing of groups begins. I mean, this is the physical application. And so we saw this with the fall of Phnom Penh, the example of the soldier spearing the beggar in the stomach, and then all the death that followed during that evacuation, that 40,000 to 400,000 number that we saw. And then last, of course, is denial. This was added later. Again, the stages were for a while 8 stages. They were then bulked out to 10, with the 10th being denial. This is where people cover the evidence. They cover up mass burials. They burn records. There is a lack or paucity of records from the Cambodian Genocide. Whether that was because records weren't kept, because that would have been considered, in a way, an intellectual process, right, of writing and recording. I do not know, but denial was there for sure, that people wanted to cover up evidence. That is an activity that students can do using Genocide Watch and looking through the different stages, and then they can take the information from the Cambodian Genocide and apply it to see examples of each of those stages. A second activity is a possibility is also located in Session 2's folders, and it's Life Under the Khmer Rouge. What was life like? So I've got a list of freedoms. These are things that we typically consider absolutely accessible and almost taken for granted here in America, versus how life was in Cambodia under the communist Khmer Rouge. I think that would be a stunning activity for students to do. Here's an example, a screenshot or two of what that would be like. So we asked the student to put an X next to personal freedoms that they currently have, and a Y for those they would be willing to give up. The X and Y mean nothing, so it could be a check mark or something. But think of these things that we probably do take for granted. The ability to eat what I want, where I want, when I want, and with whom I want. That is a pretty basic thing that we take for granted here. To keep and use your name, to enjoy music, to own clothes and jewelry, to laugh, cry, or express emotion, to converse in private. I'm assuming students will put check marks or X's for all of those and total them up. Then the question is, what would they be willing to forfeit, to forego, under an idyllic, pure form of communism that the Khmer Rouge were after? There are other examples as well. And the lists become a little broader, where they're not all ones that we necessarily currently have. So there would be some that would require a little bit more thought. Photo activity, I mentioned we saw some, I believe, some incredible photos along the way, starting with the first one of the boys, the young men, the young boys with their guns. Photos are located at that website. There is a list of websites that are used in Session 2's folder, so you'll find this website located there, or if you want to do a screenshot, grab that, or even take a picture of it with your cell phone. That way you've got the URL, or you can copy and paste from the Session 2 folder. Incredible photographs, some of which we saw. 34 stunning photographs, black and white. I think that really helps. It gives a feel. Most are black and white. They're extremely graphic, as you can imagine. The photo description accompanies each. That could be blocked out if you want to have students kind of put words to this. This is an incredible photograph of a blindfolded skull. Now, what might students think? What words could they put to that image? What thoughts could they put to that image? And there are other activities as well that I've got listed via links in Session 2's folders. Those 2 or 3 that I just kind of put there are, I think they're workable. They may be good if you take a look at them, but for sure there's also PBS's perspectives from perpetrators of genocide in Cambodia. Interesting idea. And so you follow the link in the Session 2 folder. And then USC Shoah Foundation has numerous options, of course, as you'd expect, including survivor interviews. One last thing we can do, and this could be an activity, it could also be a way to open the segment that you're going to teach on the Cambodian genocide. There's different things you can do with quotes, as you well know. But I mentioned about the Khmer Rouge and their lack of valuing life. Here's a Khmer Rouge slogan, quote, "To spare you is no profit, to destroy you is no loss," end quote. That might be a good way to open this session, open a session that you teach on the Cambodian genocide. It's a powerful quote. Another that we see that echoes the Holocaust is from Dith Pran, who was depicted in the killing fields, who said, quote, "It is important for me that the new generation of Cambodians and Cambodian Americans become active and tell the world what happened to them and their families. I want them to never forget the faces of their relatives and friends who were killed during that time. The dead are crying out for justice," end quote. So we see never forget. A last activity, a possible activity, certainly an interesting thing to see, to parallel and kind of connect with the Holocaust, is a quote from this third one here from Franz Stangl. Stangl was a horrific and fascinating character from the Holocaust. He was an Austrian policeman, father of 2. He doted on his daughters, loved his wife. He became involved with the T4 program, the Tiergartenstrasse 4, the euthanasia program that euthanized children with physical and or mental disabilities and euthanized older people. These were Germans. These were not necessarily Jews. These were German citizens who, echoing back to what we saw, life not worthy of living. So Stangl worked within that T4 program in Germany. Because of his work and his success in the Nazis' eyes, he actually became commandant of Sobibor and Treblinka. So what did this man say? "My conscience is clear. I was simply doing my duty." We come down to Pol Pot, post-genocide. Quote, "I did not join the resistance movement to kill people. Look at me now. My conscience is clear," end quote. As promised during session 1, I've begun this tracker. This tracker is going to track these genocides and mass human rights violations that we do over the next year plus.
So you'll see how it's broken down with Cambodia, and then we'll add to it with Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Turkey, China, twice, because it's so massive, and so forth. All right, so we're going to look at the event name, the dates or approximate dates, the system of governance that was used, the name used for the country, if it was totalitarian, if there was a political military leadership, and then the approximate numbers of people killed. Again, the approximate numbers of people killed is not in any way to diminish the humanity of each of the individuals. It's for us just to be able to comprehend this. So we're looking at Cambodia, and the first period is this is my name for it, is the coup civil war. So this is under General Lon Nol. The period's 1970 to 1975, and we see that as we reviewed that Nol was nationalist, unless inconvenient, and staunchly anti-communist. The country's name wasn't actually Cambodia; it was the Khmer Republic under Lon Nol. Was it totalitarian? Ultimately, it was, because we said Nol was ran the country by council, but then ended up taking it over, running it as essentially a totalitarian. The number of people killed, approximate number, 150,000. Could be low, could be high. It's based on all the different numbers I saw. That's kind of an estimate of what I found. The war, and this is the part where the United States is involved specifically. This is the period from 1970 to 1973. This is U.S. military ground, but especially air action. Obviously no name, actually it was the Khmer Republic still. Totalitarian, not applicable. Political military leadership, not applicable. Again, chose the number 60,000 as somewhere in the middle based on other reports I saw of non-combatants who were killed due to U.S. military either negligence, wanton disregard, or military insufficiency accident. The Cambodian Genocide itself, from 1975 to 1979, this was a communist government with Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. The name of the country was changed to the Democratic Kampuchea. It was ultimately totalitarian, as Pol Pot was responsible, but again, we talk about the semi-autonomous fiefdoms that were run by the cadres in the villages. Political military leader was Pol Pot, and the numbers are staggering at 2.4 million. The number is, I've seen way higher estimates. I've seen up to 3.5 million. I've seen low as well, though, 1.5 or something like that. So I took that number of 2.4. These events, the events that led up to and included the Cambodian Genocide, led to the death of approximately 2.6 plus million people, non-combatants, innocent people who were caught up in military, paramilitary, political actions. So that brings us to the end of the lecture or workshop on the Cambodian Genocide. Hopefully there's some information that you can use, maybe an idea or two that were sparked for activities that can be done to either to parallel and connect with the Holocaust, or to do as a freestanding activity. Again, as always, I want to thank the Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education, the Merrill Kohler Educator Series. Next, the third session will be on Mexico and the Mexican Revolution period. That will be session 3. That will be located on the website. If you could, if you've gone through this video, PowerPoint, if you could please email me and let me know that you attended the workshop, it would be very helpful. Again, I do need to do tracking of people who participate and take advantage of this remote teachers workshop series that will last at least a year.
I do track for the Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education and for the Merrill Kohler Educator Series. So it's important if you could let me know via email your name, the school or institution with which you are associated, the name of the workshop, the Cambodian Genocide, and the date that you took it, an approximate date that you took it. If you would please send an email to sam@hmcec.org. That's sam@hmcec.org. If you would let me know that, I would really appreciate it. I want to thank you so much for your participation. Please let me know if you have any questions or issues. I'd be happy to send documentation to you and so forth if needed. From the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center, my name is Sam Parrish, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.